our webinar today, the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism webinar series, part 3, Anti-Semitism, Free Speech, Social Media, and Corporate Accountability. This webinar is co-sponsored with Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. This webinar is part 3 of a series FMEP is launching to examine ongoing effects in the US and around the world to redefine the term anti-Semitism to mean criticism of Israel and Zionism, and to delve into the arguments and the growing efforts challenging that redefinition. At the core of this discussion is what is known as the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, promoted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That definition, including its accompanying examples, is on its way to being adopted and used across the globe to increasingly restrict free speech. From the State Department to English Premier League soccer teams, from universities to social media platforms, concerted campaigns to label criticism of Israeli policies and challenges to Zionism as anti-Semitism and to impose formal legal consequences are quietly and sometimes loudly gaining momentum. In state legislatures and Congress in the United States, across Europe and in Latin America, the Ihra Working Definition of Anti-Semitism and its examples is being used to quash criticism of Israel, to delegitimize activists for Palestinian rights, and to undermine civil society organizations, including human rights and humanitarian groups, for their work with or support for Palestinians. This politicization and in some cases apparent weaponization of the fight against anti-Semitism has grave implications, not just for Israel-Palestine activism, but for free speech and civil society writ large, as well as for the battle against real and rising anti-Semitism across the world. To discuss these issues, we are proud to host an expert panel today. I will introduce them here very briefly. You can read their full bios on our website, and in alphabetical order. Alison Carmel is the International Relations Manager at Hamla and a digital rights defender, writer, researcher, and activist. Marwa Fatafta is a Palestinian writer, researcher, and policy analyst based in Berlin. She leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region as the MENA policy manager. Laura Friedman is president of FMEP, and Brian House is staff attorney at the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Some housekeeping before we begin. As is FMEP's regular practice, the format for today's webinar will be a discussion between the panelists and myself. In addition to my own questions, we are eager to take audience questions, which can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the panel. I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and will do my best to factor as many as possible of your questions into the discussion. Also, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online immediately after it ends. Finally, if you have any technical problems with this webinar, please let us know using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't use the chat function for questions, as I may not see them. Also, during the webinar, as our panelists mention articles or reports, my colleague Sarah Ann will be putting links to these resources into the chat box, and links to all these resources will also be posted on the FMEP webpage with the webinar video. So if you miss something, don't worry, you can find it later. Okay, sorry for that long introduction. Let's dive in. We're discussing the Ihra definition of anti-Semitism and the concerted campaigns and efforts to have it adopted, used, and enforced in many different realms across the globe. For more on where it originated, who wrote it, and why, as well as where it's being implemented and how, I recommend that everyone read some key articles on the topic, which my colleague will be putting into the chat box. Now, let's start with the working definition and its relevant examples. I'm going to read it now, and my colleague will put it into the chat box. Quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. That vague statement is then followed by 11 examples, fully 7 of which are focused not on Jews but on Israel. Most important of these are, and again, I quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, or drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policies to that of the Nazis. And now let's dig in with our panelists. Brian, I want to set the scene even more broadly than just the issue of anti-Semitism by asking you what responsibility, if any, do social media companies have towards policing hate speech on their platforms? How have these companies wrestled with that responsibility? And in that context, what is the difference between protected speech and discriminatory harassment?
Well, first off, let me just say thank you for having me here today. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be speaking to you all together with my distinguished co-panelists. I'll start with my usual disclaimer, which is that I'm speaking here in my personal capacity and that my views do not necessarily represent the views of the American Civil Liberties Union. Now let's dive into that question. So I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to start by framing it in terms of legal responsibility under US law. And I think you have to divide that out into two separate questions, which is one, what kind of speech is actionable under US law and what kind of speech is protected by the First Amendment? And then to what degree do companies have immunity for posting even actionable speech on their platforms? So in terms of what's protected by the First Amendment, true threats, incitement to immediate violence, defamation, these categories are unprotected by the First Amendment because we recognize that they have significant social harms that the government has an interest in preventing. But other categories of speech, such as hate speech, are protected by the First Amendment. And the primary reason for that is hate speech is almost impossible to define in a way that achieves a societal consensus. And usually it's just speech that's hated by one particular community. And so the potential for hate speech restrictions to end up restricting political speech and to skew public debate have basically led courts to conclude that government restrictions on hate speech writ large violate the First Amendment. And I think the gray area we have here and where a lot of these battles are being fought is over what constitutes harassment. Harassment is defined in the law as a kind of conduct, and how far that extends is a matter of constant debate. But I would say the core definition of harassment under US law is repeated unconsented contact. So for example, if I were to call your home 15 times in the middle of the night, and you told me after the first time stop calling and I kept calling, that would actually violate federal law and that would be actionable harassment. But there's a large category of speech that is legally actionable, like defamation, that companies are actually immunized from liability for. Now, the traditional presumption in US law is that the publisher is just as liable as the speaker. So for example, if the New York Times were to publish an op-ed and the op-ed were to contain a defamatory falsehood about a public figure, for example, both the New York Times and the op-ed writer could be sued. That's the ordinary presumption in US law. But a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act flips that presumption on its head with respect to internet service providers. What it basically says is that as long as the internet service provider is not itself editing the user's post in a way that makes it actionable, the internet service provider cannot be held liable for the posts of its users. What that basically means is if I go on Facebook and defame my neighbor can sue me, but they can't sue Facebook for publishing the post. And people are often very upset about this. President Trump certainly seems to be very upset about this recently. But I actually think that at its core, this does a good thing, right? Companies would never host third-party speech in the broad way that they have if they could be liable for everything that users said on their platforms. Facebook simply does not have the resources or the capability to investigate every single user's post to determine whether or not it's potentially actionable as defamation. Now, there are certain exceptions to this. Speech that is a crime under federal law, if the company knows that speech is being hosted on its platform, the company can be held liable. Right, so if Facebook knows that I'm issuing death threats against the president, and somehow their chief executives have been informed of this and they refuse to take it down and they continue to republish it, under those circumstances, they could actually be held liable. But for the vast majority of speech, they're completely immunized. So in terms of legal responsibility, what we basically have is a situation where the companies have almost no legal responsibility for the speech that's hosted on their platforms. And then the question really becomes, to what degree do they have a social responsibility for moderating that speech and consistent with their community guidelines? And that's where I think things get extremely tricky, and we'll probably talk about that through the rest of this webinar, because you have to weigh competing values, right? You have to weigh values of equity and inclusion to make sure that people feel comfortable using the platforms and that community members aren't being unjustly maligned constantly. And at the same time, you also have important free expression principles, because we recognize that these platforms have basically become the public square for the 21st century. And it's a very unusual position we find ourselves in, where public political speech primarily takes place on property, essentially, that's owned by private companies. And so how companies balance those values and in essence act like mini governments. And I think it's not a coincidence that the Facebook Public Oversight Board is essentially the Supreme Court of Facebook. They're replicating governmental functions within their own platforms. How they struggle to address these questions is, I think, something that we're going to continue to see for decades to come. Peter, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you for that legal overview, Brian. It's very, very helpful. Laura, I want to go to you to set the scene of what's happening with the IHRA definition and anti-Semitism. What are social media companies doing about anti-Semitism, and how are they being pressured, and by whom, to adopt the IHRA working definition and its examples?
Thanks, Peter. And I think Brian laid the groundwork really well for this discussion. We're in a moment right now in the world, and certainly in the United States, when there is a greater focus on the dangers of hate speech and the dangers of incitement to hate and incitement to violence, and the role that social media has played in this. And I think that's appropriate given where things are today. What we are seeing in parallel as part of that rising hate that we're seeing in our society includes a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism. And it's a surge in real, lethal anti-Semitism, very similar to the kinds that our grandfathers and grandmothers dealt with years ago. It's white supremacists, it's Nazis, it's the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan. It's a hatred that is very broad and that includes Jews. And what we are seeing, whether it is out of an innocent sense of, okay, we have to define anti-Semitism as broadly as possible and kill it all, or whether it is out of, I think, some intent, a political intent, which says, this is a moment where we can use the energies around fighting anti-Semitism to actually promote a political goal. But what we have seen is an effort to get social media platforms and also academia and legislatures, you referred to all this in the introduction, to adopt a whole new view on anti-Semitism, which expands the concept to apply to criticism of Israel, critics of Israel, criticism of Zionism or Zionists. And it's quite extraordinary. And what is perhaps most extraordinary, I think, for a lot of us who are following it, is that there's actually more energy being put into clamping down on this new idea, what some people have called the new anti-Semitism, which is not the anti-Semitism which goes into synagogues and shoots people while they are praying, and it's not the anti-Semitism that defaces an Anne Frank monument with swastikas. And it's not the anti-Semitism that is threatening, Jews will not replace us. What they're focusing on is criticism of Israel. And we're seeing significant pressure being put, particularly on social media outlets. I think very much what Brian said, the public square today is social media, and everybody gets that. And, in some ways that has been a real challenge for those of us who worry about things like proliferation of hate speech and organizing extremism and all of that. On the other hand, it has allowed, in a way that is perhaps unprecedented in human history, a sharing of information, a sharing of facts, a sharing of narratives. And that sharing of narratives poses a challenge to those who want to say, you cannot have a different narrative on Israel or on Zionism, right? And at a time when those narratives are more challenging than ever for defenders of Israel, because frankly, at this moment in history, more than any time in my lifetime, it is difficult to defend Israel's policies and its behaviors, because Israel is showing the world quite clearly that it actually isn't interested in land for peace, and it isn't interested in negotiating a Palestinian state. So you're seeing almost an effort to revert to a pre-peace process, pre-Oslo kind of framing, which says these ideas themselves are unacceptable. And if we can't shut them down because people say it's free speech, then we'll shut them down saying it's anti-Semitism. And we've seen this, and I'll end with this example. There was a lot of media around a huge a letter that was sent to Facebook some months ago, signed by, I think, more than 100 largely very right-wing Jewish organizations, and it was led by organizations that are very fixated not on fighting anti-Semitism writ large, but on fighting what they see as this kind of anti-Semitism. And it's not, I wrote an article about this, which maybe we can put into the chat box. It's not attributing intent to say they're only focused on this kind of anti-Semitism. It's taking them at their word. And in this one, I would point to the intervention from one of these lawfare organizations, which has been targeting social media. And they sent letters to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube demanding that they take down horrible, evil anti-Semitic content. And all of the examples they provided of anti-Semitic content on all three of these platforms was related to Palestinian narrative, Palestinian, calls for right of return, Palestinian criticism of Israel. And this is while we have literal Nazis organizing on these platforms. This is the only thing they're focused on. And it's very challenging for social media platforms when they are trying to make clear that they do recognize the dangers of hate speech, but hate speech that actually leads to violence and all of that. As Brian said, when they're being accused of supporting anti-Semitism, and this is what people point to, it puts them in a very, very a challenging place to articulate a policy which says we're serious about anti-Semitism when people say, yes, but you're not clamping down on this, and this is the real problem. And I think that's the challenge that social media is going to have to contend with in this period.
Great. Marwa, I want to go to you. This current controversy around the Ihra definition is not the first time Palestinians have been critical of companies like Facebook and YouTube for their content policing. Could you give us some background on the battles that have gotten us to where we are today and what you think is new and different about the Ihra battle?
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, and for organizing this important and timely discussion. I want to start by highlighting or noting that today marks the 10th anniversary of the Tunisian Revolution and the spark of the Arab Spring. And on this occasion, Access Now and a coalition of human rights organizations, activists, and journalists sent a letter almost an hour ago to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, raising concerns regarding their content moderation policies and decisions that can be described as non-transparent, arbitrary, and in some cases even discriminatory towards content coming from Palestinian groups, but also activists, journalists, and oppressed groups in general, coming, whether it's from Syria, Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, and Palestine. More and more we see systematic takedowns or account suspensions of activists who have been using the same platforms in 2010 and 2011 as the only free space for them to speak up and to criticize governments and to demand change. And unfortunately, 10 years later, as I mentioned, those populations or communities are being targeted either through automated decision-making or backroom deals between governments and those platforms, whatever it is that at the end results in suspension of accounts and silencing and censoring those critical voices. And with the Palestinian case, it's no exception. It's even actually, there's much more pressure on the platforms to remove and censor Palestinian voices. So, and that started, I think the year that started all of that collaboration between the Israeli government and social media platforms, particularly Facebook, was 2016. So after the so-called third intifada, or the intifada of individuals, where we had a surge of violence, and to the Israeli government, social media companies were responsible for incitement to violence, and therefore the response or the answer is to increase pressure on the one hand on those companies to remove that content, and on the other hand arrest individuals, mainly Palestinians, for their Facebook posts or social media posts and activities. And so the Ministry of Justice set up a cybercrime unit that sends kind of informal requests not informal, but requests that are not necessarily based on any legal basis to those companies. And back at the time, the Israeli Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, said to the media that YouTube, Facebook and Twitter are responding to the government's request by a rate of 95%. So yeah, even lately, also just thinking now of examples that come to mind. A few months ago or weeks ago, the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs also sent a request to Twitter to remove what they call coordinated fake activity on the platform related to grassroots movements, criticizing or attempting to delegitimize the state of Israel. And Palestinian organizations, and maybe Alison can collaborate and give more specific examples. They have noted indeed accounts on Twitter being taken down for that included the word Zionist. So it is clear that here Zionism and Zionists are a protected group, which again, there's question marks about why should an political ideology specifically need to be protected on those platforms in comparison to others. But so we see that this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the pressure that Lara referred to from pro-Israeli groups on social media platforms to adopt this definition as part of their hate speech policy is a continuation of that pressure. But I think it will further exacerbate the restrictions and policing of Palestinian speech online, because if this definition to be adopted, we'll see further restrictions on what Palestinians and other groups are allowed to say on those platforms. And we might come, of course, to a point where there's only one narrative that is permissible on those platforms, which is extremely dangerous, given that at the end of the day, to many Palestinians and many communities across the MENA region and elsewhere, they do rely on those platforms as the only space for them to speak up freely. And unfortunately, on top of government's pressure, we now have those social media companies acting as private law enforcement, private police deciding this content is allowed, this content is not.
Thank you. I want to continue on this with Alison. If you can elaborate on how these allegations of anti-Semitism and the Ihra definition specifically are shrinking the space for freedom of expression about Palestine in the digital sphere.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that the digital sphere is having these effects online and offline. So as Marwa was saying very well, kind of explaining how some of the ways that this is operationalizing, but I also think it's just worthy to go over again that, there is artificial intelligence being employed on this, and there is manual takedowns. There are takedowns that are reported by people, and there's takedowns that are flagged by the AI. And behind this is policy or lack of policy, and really more, I would say, a push for very specific policies. And this push is coming from the Israeli government, but also a number of NGOs that are Israeli government supporting or supported by, and networks of trolls and creative, we can't say that it's not creative applications like 4IL, for example, which is an external application that sends to people who want to support Israel missions for different days and encourages them to go on and flag and report different content. And this gaming of the system, as we can really see it, is also one of the ways that is being used. There are also lots of fake accounts that are created and used on these networks. And we saw in the last Israeli election a number of accounts on Twitter's networks that were linked to Netanyahu and his political party during his election. So we know that these are the tactics of the government. And it's not only Israel, there are other countries in the world also practicing this and utilizing and weaponizing social media in this way. But as Marwa and other people understand and know, especially for Palestinians and for people in the MENA region, this is a very important space for conducting political, economic, and social life, just as is defined in the rights that people have as human rights, and as Israel and the Palestinian Authority have become signatory of the ICCPR. I hope I got that right. I'm not the lawyer in the room. I think also I just want to talk we do research, for example, in youth and what's the impact of youth. They are being depoliticized. They don't want to hold political discussions online. They are afraid to. They are self-censoring, and it's not just them. It's also leading activists. It's also ourselves. We are not comfortable to even express some of our, our well thought out ideas, or even to share an article. I will give just a few examples, and it goes beyond the spectrum. I do think that there is a hyper focus on certain IP addresses. I do not think we are all treated equally, and we've seen this with platforms, specifically with YouTube. We were able to document this, that if you uploaded a video in Palestine and if you uploaded a video in Spain and it's the same video from the same account, the video in Palestine will be taken down. So we know we're not all treated equal on this platform by any means. And I think that is very also important to remember. You have the case of Richard Silverstein, a Jewish Palestine rights activist in Seattle, Washington, who posts a Haaretz article and says Israeli settlers steal land. And this is taken as hate speech, and he is restricted on the platform for saying something that is a fact. The real concern is we're going to lose touch of reality in a way, and that we won't be able to have political conversation in these spaces. And that misinformation and disinformation and silencing is what will be the norms in the space. And let's see. So yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of like how to look at anti-Semitism. Oh, also I want to say, like, of course, this is in the offline world, I think very more well-known speakers who want to speak about anything related to Palestine are often just called anti-Semites, and this is used in order to shrink the space for freedom of expression on Palestine. They are afraid to speak out. The same thing happens online. When you are restricted by the platform and not able to speak, you are afraid the next time not to speak. So we are going to change the way that we are able to have conversation at all, internally and externally. And I think this also has to be considered on the interpersonal level, what it means for our society more generally.
That's great. Thank you, Allison. I want to go to Brian. I want to ask you about President Trump's executive order on anti-Semitism, which requires executive agencies to consider the Ihra definition when enforcing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. What's the legal effect of this executive order, and does it mean anything for social media and other private companies?
So by and large, I don't think the executive order directly affects social media companies. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act basically says that educational institutions that receive federal funding can't discriminate in access to education on the basis of race, color, or national origin. So really, this is about educational institutions that get federal funds, which in the United States is basically, certainly every college or university almost gets federal funds through Pell Grants or other student loan programs. What the executive order says is kind of tricky. It says that federal agencies applying the 1964 Civil Rights Act can consider the examples in the Ihra definition, including especially, delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israel, holding Israel to a double standard, in determining whether somebody acted with anti-Semitic intent in violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I think, as I said, I think this is intentionally vague, and there are really two ways to look at it. One way to look at it is to say, well, look, if one student assaults another on the way to class, or a professor refuses to allow a Jewish student to come into their class and just says, like, dirty Zionist, can the investigator look at that comment and think, well, that was a weird thing to say. Maybe that person was motivated by anti-Semitism and it actually wasn't based on their views about Israel. I think that's, basically unobjectionable, and that's probably what investigators were already doing. So I don't think that's what the executive order is really trying to accomplish. The other thing, the much more disturbing thing that the executive order could be doing is to say, look, actually speech that falls under the Ihra definitions, or conceivably falls under the Ihra examples, speech that holds Israel to a double standard, is itself discrimination or harassment under the civil rights laws, and the university has an obligation to shut it down. And universities, of course, because they depend so heavily on federal funding, they're not going to risk any ambiguity. So if they think it's possible that a speech could trigger the loss of their federal funding, they will take affirmative steps to prevent it. And that doesn't matter whether they're a private university or public university, they're very sensitive to their ties to federal funding in that way. So I think the purpose of the executive order is to encourage universities to take more proactive steps to censor student and faculty speech that conceivably falls under the Ihra examples, even though, if we were to go and challenge the executive order in court, I am relatively confident the government would just come back and say, look, we're just saying that you can consider these comments as evidence of intent. There's no legal problem with that. And they would be correct. And so it makes it basically impossible to challenge the executive order facially on First Amendment grounds while providing the message to universities that you should be going ahead and even more proactively than they already are, censoring this kind of student speech. And that has very, very grave implications, I think, for the free speech rights of both students and faculties at the university. I don't think it has directly significant implications for social media companies because, as I said, social media companies are not educational institutions. And by and large, at least as far as I'm aware, they don't receive significant amounts of federal funding such that that would be like the fundamental part of their bottom line. They're dependent primarily on ad revenue, not on federal funds. Indirectly, it could theoretically affect social media companies. For example, you could imagine a school saying, well, look, there's so much anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist speech going on these platforms that we now have to shut the platforms down because it's creating a hostile educational environment in our school. So we're going to basically tell our students, we're going to put up like a geofence. We're going to say, like, you can't use this social media platform on campus, and while you're on campus, you can't have access to these websites. We did see some moves in that direction actually earlier in the past decade with respect to Title IX. Some universities were considering, shutting down access to certain social media messaging apps because a lot of cyberbullying was going on in those apps. So this is something that I think could happen. So far, I haven't seen it happen a lot. I haven't seen universities taking steps to prevent students from accessing Facebook and Twitter while they're on campus, and that's partly because students would revolt, I think, if they were told they couldn't access these major social media platforms while they're at school. So I think directly speaking, the executive order does not have significant effects for social media platforms. But again, insofar as it's sending the message, and I think it really is a messaging executive order more than it's meant to have significant legal effect, that actually anti-Zionist speech is anti-Semitism. It is the new anti-Semitism, as Peter, you've put it, that it is encouraging social media platforms to take the same line, right? It's trying to create a societal norm that these things are effectively the same. And so even if social media companies don't have a legal obligation to abide by the executive order, it does serve a messaging function. And so far, I think that messaging function has been somewhat complicated by the fact that it's perceived as highly partisan, right? The Democratic Party, I think, was largely up in arms about this executive order, and certainly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party was very concerned about what it might mean. And the fact that Trump was the one who issued it had the effect of making it politically toxic in its own way. So I don't think it's been extremely effective in that regard, but I think that you will continue to see attempts in various different outlets, whether it's contracting, access to government funds, government curricula, et cetera, saying, these two things, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, are the same, and the executive order is a part of that campaign.
Thanks. I want to talk about how this is the politics of this in different places. In a second, Mara, I want to go to you to talk about Germany, because I know there's been a lot of really striking reporting about what's happening in Germany. But Laura, to start with you, just can you talk a little bit about the politics of Trump's decision to enact that executive order last year? What you think are the kind of the political effort behind this, and how adequate or inadequate has been the political response in Washington?
Sure, and here I think I'm a little bit less sanguine than Brian about how effective this has been. The president's executive order on anti-Semitism did not just appear out of nowhere. This is an effort that came from legislation that had been pushed in Congress for a few years. It was bipartisan legislation called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which has nothing to do with awareness about anti-Semitism. It is entirely about shutting down criticism of Israel on campuses, and it's framed that way explicitly by members when they talk about it. We need to push back against BDS on campus, which is, that's it. So you have this move for this legislation, which didn't pass because it raises such profound free speech challenges that it wasn't going to move easily through Congress. The president eventually did it by executive order. But let's be clear, I think the week before President Trump enacted this by executive order, we had an op-ed in Times of Israel from Congressman Deutsch, who is a leading Democrat from Florida, and he was calling for a whole of government application of the Ihra definition. That is a Democrat. The ADL supported this. The ADL, which is considered to be, critical of Trump and largely, progressive, except they are 100% behind Ihra. This is not a partisan issue as much as I think people hope that or think it might be. And the effort around to use the president's language here, I'm someone who sort of, I think all of us, as we track this, we look for where things start. You look for the seeds, right? The IHRA definition now has the force of law in this executive order. Whether people think it's meaningful or not, it has that force of law. That is now being referenced. So last year we saw efforts that died, I think, largely because of COVID, and I think they'll probably succeed this year, to pass hate crimes legislation in at least one state, Arizona, which explicitly import the IHRA definition and all of its examples they seek to import that into Arizona state law. Initially, it's imported as part of a, tracking hate speech or whatever, but then that becomes part of their sentencing guidelines. It becomes part of the aggregate. You get enhanced sentencing for hate crimes. So if this passes into law in Arizona, if you are someone who's out in a demonstration on the University of Arizona campus and you're demonstrating against, government XYZ, whatever it is, and you're carrying a Palestinian flag and you're arrested for trespassing or whatever, you may find yourself facing hate crimes, facing a hate crime sentence, because that Palestinian flag will be seen, that's anti-Semitism. I think that's what this is really about. It's about the seeds of the idea that we all can agree, right? The cultural norms Brian referenced, right? You create a cultural norm that this is what anti-Semitism is. The IHRA definition is non-controversial, except from bigots and anti-Semites who disagree with it. And let's be clear, we have reached a point now where challenging the IHRA definition is being called anti-Semitic. Which is quite extraordinary as a free speech matter. There was a recent case where the head of an organization, a Jewish head of an organization in the UK that tracks anti-Semitism and fights anti-Semitism, wrote an article challenging or expressing concerns with the IHRA definition. And that was followed by an article by two people who work at his institution, essentially saying that his article essentially was full of anti-Semitic tropes by challenging the IHRA definition. And we've seen this elsewhere as well. This is antithetical to the very notion of free speech and debate. And by the way, I'll say this as a Jewish person, it's antithetical to the Jewish reverence for debate, right? Whether it's debate about our identity or our obligations as Jews or about Zionism, and those debates within the Jewish community go back to pre-1948, debating Zionism. But now you can't debate Zionism because that would be anti-Semitic. Those cultural norms are incredibly powerful, and that is why the effort is now to establish them and set them into cement. And in terms of the legal implications, Brian is giving, what would be like if we actually cared about the intent of law and, good actors. There are bad actors who are out there seeking, whether it's with slap suits, which are basically just harassment lawsuits, which are lawsuits that you don't intend to win. If you win them, that's a bonus, but just merely by putting them out there, you cause people misery and reputational harm and all of that. So we're seeing slap suits around these things. We're seeing an industry of people writing legal letters threatening people that you will run afoul of the law, even if it's simply not true. The law doesn't say what they say it says. But if you're a university getting a letter saying you potentially could run afoul of the law, whether it's using IHRA or claiming that every Palestinian organization is related to terrorism, people look at those letters and say, oh crap, do we want to even open ourselves up to this misery? And on top of that, I would say we have at least one legal actor who is systematically trying to find ways to apply whatever laws he can find. And the IHRA definition is one of them. So we have a pending complaint now before the IRS seeking to use the executive order to take away the nonprofit status of a US foundation, based on the argument that this foundation's relationship to Students for Justice in Palestine constitutes support for anti-Semitism. And the corollary argument that's being made, which is that by enjoying nonprofit status as a foundation, it is receiving federal funds and therefore is now violating the Title VI requirements. So that's being tested. It may not work, but again, the chilling effect is working enough, even if it doesn't. I don't know if social media are receiving similar letters from lawfare groups around IHRA. I'd be shocked if they weren't.
Marwa, I want to go to you. Laura's just talked about some of the dynamics that are playing out in the United States. You're based in Berlin. My reading is that those dynamics maybe even have even taken on greater force in Germany with its own understandably very fraught history and understandable desire of Germans to want to steer very clear of anti-Semitism. There was a very striking Haaretz piece recently about the extreme lengths to which people who run cultural institutions in Germany must go to avoid any taint of being connected, for instance, to the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what's happening in Germany.
You're on mute.
You're muted, Marwa. There
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to share personal experiences. Actually, I moved to Germany 6 years ago, and I got introduced firsthand to the witch hunt. I would call it witch hunt that is happening in Germany regarding any Palestinian or pro-Palestinian groups that speak on the matter Palestine-Israel. So to give you like concrete examples, any Palestinian who is participating at a conference or a workshop that is not necessarily political. So a friend of mine, she's a professor of sociology speaking on feminist issues not related to Palestine. She was participating at a grassroots left-wing feminist conference, and the organizers, upon pressure from unknown groups, sometimes we know who these people are, who are sending letters and adding pressure on organizers to cancel Palestinians' participation. Sometimes, you know, it looks like an organized campaign. So people who are actively monitoring and seeing who is speaking where and then taking action accordingly. So this friend of mine was asked by the organizers to clarify her position towards BDS. And towards the two-state solution versus one-state solution. And they refer to her signing on an online petition from years and years ago. So someone did mining, like proper research on the internet to see what's this person's connection to BDS, and therefore communicating that to the organizers. I mean, this is a stark violation of someone's right to freedom of expression and belief. I mean, this person does not need to clarify what's their position towards Palestinian cause, towards Israel, or any other matter in order to be able to participate in a conference that is not related to her personal beliefs and positions. I have been myself accused of anti-Semitism for participating at a German digital rights organization speaking about predictive policing conducted by the Israeli government. I've found my name on a website calling me an anti-Semitic propagandist, and they didn't find any links, direct links to BDS, and so they called me a BDS sympathizer. I think that's the best next thing for them. And most recently, the witch hunt has went to unbelievable levels. A few months ago, a number of non-Zionist Israeli Jews living in Berlin held a series of webinars called School for Unlearning Zionism. And I was invited to speak. They were attacked by a German white person, journalist, calling them anti-Semitic and calling the entire event anti-Semitic. And they had like put pressure on the university, so they also canceled funding and of the event, and they removed their website. They took down their website. The audacity to me that you can use, as a white German, can use anti-Semitism to smear and silence Israeli Jews or Palestinians that have the right to speak and discuss their own issues and their own pasts and future is quite remarkable. And we see more and more of that. You know, the use of anti-Semitism to literally scare off, because in Germany, if you're called anti-Semitic, that would be the end of your career. That would be the end of your social life. Nobody wants to be associated with you. As Lara mentioned, it's enough to be called that. That's enough to inflict misery and pain on you and isolate you politically, socially, professionally, and that's quite powerful. So they have been using that systematically to end any sort of public debate on Israel-Palestine or any legitimate criticism of Israel. I mean, I can offer so many examples related to that here in Germany, but in an interesting twist of events, actually a few days ago, major cultural organizations in Germany sent an open letter saying that's enough. We are not able to hold any cultural events anymore. We're not able to conduct meaningful and open and free discussions and bring in participants because of this systematic silencing that is taking place in Germany. And so I do hope that we will somehow be able to challenge that perspective. And of course, I can't discuss Germany without mentioning the non-binding parliament resolution that was passed last year criminalizing basically BDS and calling it anti-Semitic. And even though it's not legally binding, we can see already the effect of that, how it's being used and weaponized against Palestinian and even non-Zionist Israelis living in Germany.
Thanks. Yeah, it's so vexing that one can't but be grateful that Germans feel that they have a special obligation in the wake of the Holocaust. It just seems to me that there's this misunderstanding about what that special obligation is, that it's understood as a special obligation to Jews per se, such that whoever happens to hold power in the Jewish community can define that obligation to whatever political purpose they want, rather than being an obligation towards human rights, towards Jews, but also towards all people. That is the right way to kind of redeem the experience of the Holocaust. But Alison, I wanted to go to you. One of the, it seems to me that the difficult challenges here can be that, given that Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, its symbols are also Jewish symbols, that there can be sometimes ambiguity about when the phrase Zionist, for instance, is actually referring to an ideology and when it's a code word for someone who's Jewish. So for instance, if someone were to say, the Zionists are trying to take over the world, or the Zionists have created COVID, one might think, well, wait a second here. Are you really talking about Zionists as a political ideology and a national movement, or is this just now a new way of saying Jew? And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how one should think through these cases, trying to figure out whether Zionism is really referring to an ideology, or whether there may be cases in which it's become a code word for Jew.
Yeah, so these are exactly the kind of things that often Hamla weighs in on in discussions that we have with social media companies, particularly at this time. I think there's been a lot of discussions with Facebook on this issue as well. So it's a part and parcel of the IHRA definition, but actually it's being looked at a bit in separate terms. And I think that, one of the key things to think about is also how it's operationalized. So we have the definition and whether it is a proxy for Jewish or not, and we understand that Zionism is a political, a political affiliation or a political ideology. So being able to discuss a political ideology is an appropriate thing on the platform, but the context in which it can be done in can sometimes lead to a situation in which the definition itself is used, as you're saying, in a way that is to be hateful, to harass people as a form of hate speech. But I think it is important to have the distinction and the difference. In Palestinian, for anyone who's visited Palestine, or for anyone who listens sometimes to Arabic, or who understands some of the different languages, also you can hear also amongst Palestinians a conversation about what's the difference between Zionists and what's the difference between Jews. And people will affirm to you again and again that there's not a problem with Jews as a religious people. The problem is with Zionism as a political ideology. And really, I think the Palestinian community has really been working to separate that out in years and make that more and more clear. We can't say that for everyone in the Palestinian community. It's a diverse community just as any is. But I think that when we're looking to Facebook about how they're going to see this policy, how they will implement this policy, it's very important for them to be keeping this difference and between it's being a political thing or something that's, you know, one of what they call like the protected characteristics, and that's more related to religion or ethnic identity. So I think that it has to do also with the way in which they will decide to operationalize this, as they call it. So whether it's going to have to do with, for example, a news article that is shared or a blog post that is shared that has the word Zionist and, I don't know, Zionist attacked, or you know, what is it going to be in the title of this post that we're talking about? Is it in the words of the user? Is it in the comments and the discussion that's happening? It's all different layers, and how they will choose to look at it will change. But what I think is really important to remember is that we also have to look at the universality of this. We're talking a lot about the specifics and how this impacts Palestinians, but actually the concern is that if you're trying to make these community standards that are universal across, you know, different contexts, then you know, things like, for example, the newest statement really from Facebook is around Holocaust denial, and of course, like, it's very important, you know, that to manage misinformation and disinformation on the platform, but Holocaust denial has been looked at as hate speech. And, you know, does that mean that when we talk about Armenian genocide, that this is a form of, if we deny the Armenian genocide, this is a form of hate speech? It could be, but this is not the way that it's being implemented. We just see it being implemented and talked about and discussed when it has to do with the Holocaust. So I also think there's really important need to broaden it, and for us all the time when we're thinking through this, as you say, Peter, like, to think beyond just this specific instance of Palestine, because you will find a lot of other actors ready to call Facebook out for not making things universal, and they can do that in their favor and for further political gain. So I think we do have to work through the exercises. But there are also, I will just mention briefly, like, there are like specific cases, like using the word Zionist state even, or Jewish state. These words have, when people use them in the context of being critical of the Jewish state or critical of the Zionist state or critical of Zionism, that has all been seen as hate speech. So I think we really need to protect the political speech here and not confuse what's the difference between calling out a political entity and specifically targeting a people or peoples.
Peter, can I add something to
Yeah,
that?
please.
So, I mean, this is something I think all of us who are on social media, I mean, like, I'm on Twitter, I get horrible abuse and I see horrible abuse. And I think it's something we all have thought about a lot and need to keep thinking about. What seems clear to me, and other people have run similar examples past me, like what you just did, is, you know, there are examples that really do feel like coded anti-Semitism, and those tend to be examples where the context has nothing to do with Israel or Zionism. The context is completely unrelated to actual criticism of Zionism. And by the way, those statements don't tend to come from Palestinian activists. Those kinds of statements, like you read, tend to come from the white supremacists and the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan types, right? This is from people who have a generalized hatred of Jews, and they are just using the word Zionist in place. What is, I think, important, and context does matter. And I don't want to suggest that when someone sees a video of Israeli soldiers, you know, entering a home in the middle of the night and rousting Palestinian children, the kind of videos that are posted online by Israeli NGOs who are trying to challenge the policies of their own government, and someone puts a comment on that saying, you know, Zionists, you know, do terrible things, I believe that that comment is probably painful for a lot of maybe my family members who see it and say, well, there's maybe more context and maybe these people are terrorists. It's painful, and they're maybe deeply offended by it. but it's not anti-Semitic to say the word Zionist to apply to someone who is a self-identified Zionist when you are criticizing or commenting on acts they are undertaking which embody that Zionism. That's a statement of fact. It's like what Allison said. We get to a point where like we're completely disconnected from fact. If you are criticizing someone who would say proudly, I am a Zionist, it is because of my Zionism that I believe we have a claim to Judea and Samaria, and you say Zionists are trying to take Palestinian land, they would say, yes, I'm a Zionist, but you're not allowed to call me that. I mean, that's kind of the game that we're in right now. And where it becomes challenging is it requires people to make judgments. And it's particularly challenging because even if someone does intervene, the human factor, and make all of those judgments and say, you know what, those first examples Peter gave, those are anti-Semitism. These other ones, I don't think they are. But when you make that judgment, you're going to get attacked by the entire ecosystem of organizations out there who say, you're wrong. That second one is anti-Semitism too, because we don't want people criticizing Israel, and we do not want people challenging the Zionism that is at the root of Israel. And therefore you, if you're not going to call that anti-Semitism, you either support anti-Semitism or you are an anti-Semite. And that's the kind of problem, because we can say, well, how do we distinguish? If the bottom line is you're not going to be permitted to distinguish, then we have to talk about that.
And I'm sorry, just to add something on here, but you get my, imagination clear a bit, which is that, it will start with Zionists, but then we won't be able to say apartheid, we won't be able to say occupation, we won't be able to say many other words will come with it. And I think that the language of human rights is being taken away from us, potentially with these kinds of political moves, and that this is, this is the kind of thing that, that I think is really concerning, is just what a landslide of other words may be included.
Brian, I want to, go ahead, Marwa, and then we'll come to you, Brian.
Yeah, if I can jump very quickly to build on what Alison said, I think the direction where we're going is that the very expression of Palestine and Palestinian identity will become anti-Semitic. One indication of that, for example, here, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is a political foundation, belongs to the CDU, Angela Merkel's party, held a seminar called Palestine as a problematic, so the word Palestine as a problematic expression, and then going on in the event description how Palestine, the word itself, and Palestinian expressions, words, phrases such as from the river to the sea, are problematic and anti-Semitic. So it's no longer about just talking or attacking Jews or expressing hatred towards Jews, and then that got elevated to the point where it's conflated with criticisms of Israel. The next step would be any expression of Palestine or Palestinian identity is again anti-Semitic. Technically we're talking about an erasure of narrative and erasure of identity. So that's why, again, we're not addressing real anti-Semitism committed by right-wing extremists. As Laura mentioned, where the main purpose on target is very, very clear.
Brian, you've been very patient. I wanted to ask you, one of the things we've learned, particularly in the Trump era, but is that, governments learn from one another. And then often, or even in the post 9/11 era, we saw that once the United States launched a war on terror, all kinds of governments around the world, you started to use this word terrorism as a way of responding to their own, political threats. There's even reporting that in China that that one of the things that they used to justify this horrific repression in Xinjiang was kind of the America's war on terror. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what, if anything, you're seeing, or if what we could see about the way in which other governments or supporters of other governments might use this as this model of essentially criticism or quote unquote delegitimization as bigotry, and where else that might be a threat to free speech.
Right. So, I think that, in general, the United States is widely recognized to have like the most protective view towards free speech out of many of the developed countries, right? So we're recognized as having the most robust protections around these sorts of issues. And so as the United States government starts trying to infringe on these things, for example, by adopting the Ihra definition and the examples into federal law, that kind of, it sends a permission signal to governments throughout the world saying like, oh, well, if the United States is going to go ahead and say that this can be outlawed, then we can certainly do that, because our laws have always been less tolerant of what political constituencies refer to as hate speech than the United States have. So if the United States thinks this is over the line, then certainly we can enact even more robust protections. And I think you're exactly right that governments do learn from one another. And within the United States especially, you see this at the state level, right? Like there are legislative exchanges where one state passes a bill saying that boycotts of Israel are inherently anti-Semitic, and anybody who contacts with the state can't participate in a boycott of Israel. And then all of a sudden the next year, and Laura has the details and the data to back this up, 15 states have passed that law. And they're often just identical copycat laws that you just see passed over and over and over again. And so figuring out how those lines are drawn ends up, within the context of the United States political system, becoming a federal issue, right? Because we have to figure out a rule that will work across the country, because speech is often taking place between states. These states have millions of people, and if it's just Texas doing it, that still affects millions and millions of people. So that's why at the ACLU specifically, we've come in and litigated these state level cases with a national strategy in mind, because we recognize that what you do in Texas is going to have effect on what happens today, is going to have an effect on what happens in Massachusetts tomorrow. And so upholding robust free speech principles in one place ends up having the effect of strengthening them in other places. And so, for example, I think our successful lawsuits against the anti-BDS laws in Kansas and Arizona and Texas were meaningful in our ability to push back on the federal anti-boycott legislation that they were trying to pass through Congress. We were able to go and say, look, federal courts have been striking these down, saying these violate fundamental First Amendment principles. It's a little bit different in the global context that you referenced, right? Because there's not a Supreme Court of the world. So we can't reference United States legal decisions to say, obviously you have to follow this and you don't get a say in it. Every country can decide for itself. But I do think, as you were saying, that there is kind of a path dependency going on here. Countries are watching what each other is doing, and political constituencies in one country saying, look, Texas just passed this law, so obviously it's okay, we should pass it here too. And so ultimately this ends up becoming a global fight. And that's why I think it's important to frame it not just in terms of principles of US law and US doctrine and US cases, but in terms of values of free expression that are universal and that can be argued and fought for in diverse contexts and diverse legal systems.
Laura, I want to go to you just to talk about the Biden administration. Do we yet have any tea leaves about how the Biden administration may approach these issues from either statements or some of the people who've now been appointed? And what would you say are the key decision points that the Biden administration may face, in the coming year?
I'm very cautious about trying to find tea leaves, let alone read them. I think it's really difficult, and I think it's generally a mistake to try to predict it too high resolution. They certainly in the Democratic platform, there was a little bit of language in there attached to their criticism of BDS, which gave a nod to concern for free speech. And that's good. It's good that it was there. It'd be bad if it wasn't. It was certainly insufficient, and but it's better than nothing. I think there's two different forces now acting on the new administration. One of those forces is the one that's already in place, and it's very strong, which says we need to keep going, and fighting anti-Semitism means clamping down and doing everything possible to delegitimize and, if possible, criminalize boycotts of Israel, boycotts of settlements. By the way, those are considered equally the same, and criticizing under U.S. law adopted under President Obama. By the way, going back to the bipartisan nature, it was under Obama we had two laws adopted that conflate settlements and the state of Israel in opposing boycotts, imposing trade differentiation between the two. And that language of those laws was, I think, actually almost cut and pasted into Secretary of State Pompeo's latest policy change, which basically applies, treats Area C, both settlements and Palestinian areas of Area C, as sovereign Israel for the purposes of U.S. policy. The Biden administration is going to have decision points on this in a few places. The first one is what it does with executive orders. It is sort of widely understood that there is a process already going on looking at executive orders to figure out which ones they are going to get rid of right from the outset, because there are some executive orders there that they clearly are going to want to say, this no longer applies, this is a mistake, we reject it, we tear it up. Will they put the executive order on anti-Semitism on that list? They should. I think it's improbable that they will. I think there's a very high political cost. And, I think Brian's right when he said that the anti-Semitism executive order was not, it was seen as very partisan. And I think it was seen at the time as the president trying to deflect attention from the anti-Semitism of his supporters, and yet it was also applauded and complimented, and it's one of these things that's still referenced by Jewish communal organizations. It's worth noting that the Jewish Federations of North America, when they issued their letter of what their priorities for the Biden administration, they wanted to see the adoption of bipartisan legislation that implements the IHRA definition. So there's going to be a lot of pressure from sort of status quo pro-Israel forces, as they would define themselves, pro-Israel, to continue the march forward on the IHRA definition. The challenge, I think, for the Biden administration, if they want to roll back the pieces that Trump, where he's really gone too far in the eyes of most people. For example, the list that is forthcoming from the State Department of evil NGOs, which they're either going to call anti-Semitic or because they support BDS, based on IHRA saying BDS is anti-Semitism. When that was initially trotted out as an idea, you had groups like the Anti-Defamation League saying, no, 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 don't do that. You had Congressman Deutsch say, opposing it. The problem there is it's sort of like I said to someone, it's sort of like, you've created a monster, you've fed it, and it's grown up under your care, and now you've set it loose in the world. It's a little hypocritical to now say, oh, but we didn't mean for it to destroy that city, just those cities over there. You let loose the monster, it's going to rampage through the world. And that's really what's happening here with this framing around BDS and anti-Semitism. And I don't see any sign that the Democratic Party or the mainstream that's around Mr. Biden are prepared to actually challenge the monster itself. There is real anti-Semitism out there. It needs to be curbed. I don't see them being prepared to say, listen, we're not going to accept your conflation, and we're not going to play this game where the Republicans say, oh, look, that member of Congress met with people who support BDS, therefore they're an anti-Semite. And what we have seen for the past few years, they do that, and Democrats basically attack their own on behalf of Republicans. I mean, the dynamic is so clear, and I don't see any energies around shifting to a position which says we embrace the spectrum of legitimate views, and they are legitimate views on Israel-Palestine within our party. We will not allow this to be instrumentalized against us in a partisan way or politicized in a way that limits our policies on Israel-Palestine. On the other hand, mitigating against that is a stronger progressive contingent in Congress, which I think does make a difference, and a much stronger progressive contingent in the grassroots, which is why we have this new contingent in Congress. And that is something that the president and his administration are going to have to contend with. If they continue down the route of IHRA, I think they're going to face significant pushback.
Marwa, I want to go to you. One of the things that comes up a lot in these conversations is about the idea of self-determination. That, I just saw a tweet yesterday. Jews, like all peoples around the world, have the right to national self-determination, and to deny that to only one group, to Jews, is anti-Semitic. I wonder if you can talk about the use of this phrase self-determination or national self-determination as part of this definition of anti-Semitism. What's the right way to think about what rights there are what rights are universal in terms of self-determination and what are not?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but I guess one of the criticisms of that specific example, that you can't criticize the Jews' right to self-determination or the foundation of Israel as a racist state, it negates the fact that by not being able to do so, Palestinians are denied also their right to self-determination. I'm not a lawyer, but under international law, all populations and people are entitled or have the right to self-determination. So from that perspective, that one group has the protected right, while others can be occupied for decades, can be erased, can have their homes demolished, can be expelled, their IDs and or identity taken away from them, is permissible to allow the other group to have that right and enjoy that right. Is of course questionable. And this is not exactly my area of expertise, but I think it is important to again ground this conversation in international human rights law and the application of that also to social media platforms. Because if social media companies decide to adopt this definition away from human rights framework, and that's again another criticism that we have towards these platforms, that all their policies and decisions are basically decided and developed and implemented often away in isolation from the communities that they are affected by those decisions, and also away from the human rights law framework, which is, I have to say that, to highlight that companies do have a responsibility under the UN guiding principles to respect and protect human rights, and also to address any violations of their users' rights as a result of their policies, services, or products. So it's, I think like under international law, the idea of limiting hate speech, so the freedom of expression is protected, and in order to limit it, states have to go through this test of legality, necessity, and proportionality in order to justify why certain speech needs to be restricted. And therefore, when it comes to hate speech, you have to strike this balance between protecting that right and at the same time protecting vulnerable groups. And this is the window where governments often use hate speech, incitement to violence, and terrorism, and abuse these terminologies to stifle and crack down on political dissent. And that is the current case we're discussing now when it comes to Palestine and Palestinian narrative and the IHRA definition. And so when these companies, and so far I think Facebook had resisted adopting the definition, they see it as a valuable guide, but they decided, okay, maybe they differ or have a different opinion about some specific examples of the IHRA definition. But one of the key points that come to mind, and I think Alison raised it, is the operationalization of this definition. So to put it in simple terms, the way social media companies look at content and make content moderation decisions, they use two main tools. Either human moderators review that content if it's flagged by users, or and they can review the content and make a decision according to manuals and according to content moderation policies, or they have to use artificial intelligence automated decision making. And in many cases, automated decision-making is basically deaf and blind to understanding context, whether it be political, societal, cultural, or linguistic context. And here, I think Lara and mentioned, the importance of context in order to determine what actually constitutes anti-Semitic or not, when we talk about Zionism, for example, on those platforms. And so when these companies, let's say, adopt this definition, how are they going to develop and program their automated decision-making algorithms to take down content? I mean, we already have that problem. We have lots of what we call false positives. Content that should not have flagged and removed, but should not have been, simply because the algorithm doesn't really understand if this is satire, if, what's the political background and history and context of this content, and so on. So unfortunately, if that definition, I do hope that Facebook continues to resist the adoption of this definition, and other social media companies do, because again, the problem is how are you going to exactly utilize it, and what does that mean also for all sorts of legitimate free speech that is expressed by not necessarily Palestinians, but basically anyone who's using that platform. So we'll see more and more of those false positives. And I think it's important to highlight here the larger picture in which we're having this conversation right now. So social media companies are facing huge pressure to remove hate speech and terrorist content on the one hand, and they're also facing the threat of finally being regulated by government. So the days of self-regulation for those companies might come to an end soon. A few days ago, the European Commission launched the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, which these are legislations that would eventually regulate big social media companies and other tech companies. In the US, there are many discussions, and Trump again comes up with an executive order what's the word? I lost the word. Basically to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And similar to, again, the Democrats and Republicans are both saying, having, criticisms and reassessing the need to whether to reform Section 230 or not, which, as Brian mentioned earlier, gives those platforms immunity from being sued or being held liable for content published on their platforms. And so the fear that these companies in this kind of environment where there is more and more pressure that they will be regulated in the US, they will be regulated in the EU, that they will make concessions, and then they will try to listen to those, the more pressure coming from those groups, that they will heed the call and say, okay, this is what we're doing to elevate the problem, or to settle the problem and fight hate speech and fight disinformation and so on, in an attempt for them to push against them being regulated. And from that perspective, I think the fact that Facebook went ahead and launched this the oversight board, which can be seen as a Supreme Court, is again an attempt for them to continue self-regulation. We know that issues are getting too complicated, so let us take a preemptive step and let us do it ourselves through an independent oversight body. But again, and I think in this specific political climate, we hope that social media companies do not continue resisting and do not implement this IHRA definition for all the reasons we explained and discussed.
Laura, we have a couple of questions essentially asking what would be an alternative definition of anti-Semitism that would avoid these pitfalls, and I wonder if you have some thoughts about that, or if you know of folks who are working on that.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of efforts. There's one effort you can actually see online from the Canadian Independent Jewish Voices, IJV. They've actually come up with I think a good stab at this. I think there's some efforts going on with anti-Semitism and Holocaust history experts around the world. So it's a couple different efforts. Hopefully we'll see some of those see the light of day soon. I think that if nothing else, the Ihra definition is so lacking. The first part, when you read it, I don't know if people remember what it said. You should people can look at it again in the chat. Even the part that has nothing to do with the Israel examples, the actual definition itself is so bizarrely worded. It does not shed light truly on what would be anti-Semitism. It's not particularly useful. And I think it's really provoked a good discussion about what it should be instead. I would actually like to turn that question over to Brian, because I'm very curious from an ACLU free speech perspective, what is the right way to go about this? We're all doing this sort of from our, as my grandma would say, our kishkas, our guts. But what is the right way to go about doing this to preserve free speech and actually fight anti-Semitism?
Right. So, I think, the first thing that we need to recognize is that it's probably going to be impossible to come up with the definition of anti-Semitism or racism or misogyny or anything that's going to get, a truly robust consensus. We live in a highly polarized society. I think that's true of most industrialized countries at this point. I think it's a condition of living in an industrialized democracy is significant amounts of political polarization. and trying to get people to all come together and agree on these fundamental issues, right, about how we relate to one another, is going to be extremely difficult, especially when it comes to speech. And so I think that in some ways the law treats this, at least in the context of the United States, the law says, okay, we're not going to try to figure out what political positions are out of bounds and what political positions are in bounds, because we recognize that in some sense that's a fool's errand. It's always going to be used to benefit whoever happens to have political power, whether that's in the form of democratic majorities or the Supreme Court at that time. And it's never going to achieve the kind of robust societal consensus that is a stable path for going forward. And the law says, instead of trying to do that, we should let people debate that in society, right? And everybody can have their particular view of what constitutes anti-Semitism and what doesn't, and can hash those things out in the private sphere for themselves. For purposes of government regulation, we look at other aspects of the speech to decide whether it's the kind of thing that the government should effectively suppress. And we start with the presumption that all speech, or most speech, and certainly political speech, kind of lies at the heart of what we're trying to protect. And so we're going to be extremely careful before we come in and try to censor that. And so, for example, in the incitement doctrine, I think it's a good example. And incitement is important because it's often brought up in these debates. People say, like, well, you're inciting violence. In US law, incitement has been narrowed to a very specific meaning, which is that you have to objectively and intentionally incited people to immediate violence. So it's not enough to say, we need to have a socialist revolution in this country. There were attempts to basically say that was incitement in the 1920s and 1930s, and governments were, suppressing anti-war activists, suppressing communists on the grounds that they were inciting sedition. The Supreme Court eventually stepped in and said, no, that's what that ends up doing is stifling political debate. And it's used too much for partisan or purely subjective or ideological reasons. So we're going to insist on this limit that says, in the moment, it had to be urging people to commit violence right then against an identifiable individual or group. And so that's something that we can actually step back and look at more objectively, right? Without coming in with all our political baggage and ideological views and say, like, okay, was this person asking a crowd of supporters to go attack somebody right now? If so, there's a very good chance that falls under incitement. If not, it's protected speech. It's the same thing with stuff like true threats, right? We look at whether the person is objectively threatening an act of violence against another specific individual at that moment or in the future. But we don't go in and say, well, this person's engaging in a lot of violent rhetoric and that's creating an unsafe atmosphere, because we recognize that there's going to be wide societal disagreement about what that constitutes. And we don't necessarily trust judges to share our political convictions about those things. And so we say, we're just going to take the government out of this and we're going to let people sort it out for themselves. I think it's more difficult when you get into questions of platforms and how they deal with it, because obviously they're not directly the government, and they do have an interest in creating communities where people feel comfortable interacting with one another. So they don't necessarily need to follow the very strict rules that the Supreme Court has laid out for this kind of stuff. But I think that as a first line, that's what they should be focusing on: is what kinds of speech, irrespective of how extreme politically we may find it or how noxious the views are there aspects of the speech that we would recognize, regardless of what the political views being advanced were, that make it unprotected? Is it urging people to commit violence? Is it expressing a threat? Is it repeatedly and unconsentedly contacting somebody and trying to annoy them and bug them off the platform? That's the kind of stuff that companies are well placed to address. So I think that's the first place where companies can look at censorship as an option. On the other end of the spectrum, because people have such different beliefs, I think the best tool that companies have at their disposal for regulating their platforms for optimal experiences for everybody is to say, look, we're going to let you tailor your experience for yourself, right? If you don't want to see this kind of thing, we're going to give you all the tools that we have at our disposal to make sure you never have to see it, and so that your experience on this platform is insulated from it. Now, obviously, it's not going to address everything, because there is stuff in this middle area where we're saying, okay, like, it's not, my concern is not that I'm seeing it. My concern is that everybody's seeing it. And this is where we talk about disinformation and I think hate speech probably falls into this category too. Like, I'm worried, if there's all these conspiracy theories, about a Jewish plot to install COVID, in the United States. Like, I'm not worried about me seeing that. I'm actually worried about everybody else seeing that. And I'm concerned if Facebook's algorithm is pushing that to the top of its newsfeed. And so the kind of intermediate tools that the companies have at their disposal there is, either deplatforming, where they basically say, like, we're not going to prioritize this on our platform. We are going to let people who want to talk to like-minded other people, we're not going to directly shut them down. And we recognize that's a very significant intervention, and we want to be very cautious about where are Facebook's own blind spots might intervene and prevent people from being able to organize just because Mark Zuckerberg doesn't like a particular political ideology, right? We don't want that situation. But we say, look, Facebook, it has an editorial function and it can decide what speech it wants to promote and what speech it doesn't want to promote. And so that's sort of deplatforming and saying, like, we're going to allow this thing to, go like gangbusters on our platform and rise to the top of the newsfeed. And this other thing, we're going to intervene and maybe suppress it. That's one option that they have. The other option that they have is counter speech. And you've seen this on Twitter with, all Trump's, lies about the election. Facebook will just fact check the tweet itself and append its little thing saying, like, this actually contains disputed information about the election. You shouldn't take it all that seriously. Those are not interventions that I think are always a good idea. I think people don't like it when they feel like they're being manipulated or condescended to by a platform, because their natural response to that is, well, who elected Mark Zuckerberg to tell me what I should think about this, right? So I think the platforms need to recognize that those are significant interventions, but there is a place for them. And I think that those interventions are preferable to platforms coming in and saying, like, we're not going to allow this on our platform at all. And I think a good recent example of that was the Zoom interventions with regards to university events that featured Layla Khalid either in video or remotely. And they said, we're not going to allow this on Zoom at all, right? So people who wanted to attend that conference, who wanted to hear what Layla Khalid had to say, what the professors had to say about her and her work, were prevented from being able to access that completely because Zoom decided for them, here's what we're going to allow. And in a time when everybody's basically using Zoom, we're using Zoom right now, to have these discussions, Zoom basically gets to decide what political debate we're allowed to have in this country. And it's, instead of scholars deciding who gets to come to their conference, you've got social media platforms deciding for them. And I think that is, the most dangerous situation. And that's why I think outright censorship is a tool of last resort and really should only be used in cases of the most egregious and harmful speech, and not used to address speech that we would consider politically obnoxious or hateful or et cetera. Full censorship is a very, very dangerous tool for addressing those kinds of things, because people are going to disagree, and tech companies, frankly, are not representative of the entire world's populace and their views on this issue. So social media companies should not be deciding for everybody what political debates we're allowed to have and what political debates we're not allowed to have.
That's on that note, we're going to have to end. There were a lot of questions in particular about the IHRA definition and efforts to push back on it. If folks want to learn more about that, I would encourage you to go to fmep.org to look at the first two events that we did on this subject, and then also to look for announcements of two that will be coming up in January. One was called Implications and Impact of IHRA on Palestinians. The other is called Redefining Anti-Semitism, Opportunities and Struggles for Progressive Jews. Again, they'll be both in January. And I want to thank, on behalf of MEP, I want to thank Allison, Marwa, Brian, Lara for participating. If you want to learn more about them and their work, follow them on Twitter. You can check out the website of their organizations in the chat box. And thank you all for being part of this conversation.
Thank you.